Hello, and welcome to the local history of Northern Kentucky on our YouTube channel. My name is Kate, and today we're going to be exploring our aviation history through photographs from the library's Faces and Places database. And this first image that we have here may be one of the earliest aviation images that we have. However, an exact date and location is not known. This one comes from the Wolking collection, and this is a view of a U.S. Mail Express biplane with a man in the cockpit and a woman standing alongside. And so officials of Boone, Kenton, and Campbell counties lobbied Congress to build an airport in northern Kentucky. And in October of 1942, Congress supplied the $2 million that was needed to construct 4 runways. The new airfield opened a couple of years later, and 3 days after its opening, B-17 bombers began making exercise takeoffs and landings. And Boone County Airlines was the first airline there, and they operated out of a wood frame building until the construction of the 3-story brick terminal, which was dedicated in 1946. And a year after the terminal was dedicated, the airport saw its first commercial flight, which was an American Airlines Dc3 that touched down. And minutes later, Delta and TWA flights also followed. And these are a couple of photos from the original airport terminal. The one on the left is from the Jim Kelly collection, and the photo on the right is from the collection of Robert and Viola Marshall. And this is Debbie Bolin with the spade used in the original groundbreaking in May of 1943. And this photo was taken in May of 1968 on the airport's 25th anniversary. And this is a Trans World Airlines Lockheed Constellation. And the Constellation, often called Connie for short, was introduced commercially in 1945 with TWA. And Howard Hughes, who owned the airline at that time, helped to develop the aircraft by proposing specifications for it. And he wanted a plane for his fleet that could carry at least 20 passengers and 6,000 pounds of cargo. So during the development and production, Howard Hughes demanded total secrecy, and he also stated that he did not want Lockheed selling them to any other airlines until TWA had 35 of them. And in this photo, which is part of the Jim Kelly collection, they are in the midst of loading and fueling the plane. And this particular Constellation was delivered to the airline in September of 1950, and it was named the Star of Missouri. And after it was retired by TWA, it had several owners, and it was scrapped by 1999. But one kind of interesting note about the aircraft is that its 3 engines were used in the restoration of another Constellation, which was restored here, and then it was flown to the Netherlands after the restoration was completed. And that plane is now at the Dutch Aviation Museum. And this is a TWA DC3, also from the Jim Kelly collection in Faces and Places. And food and other supplies are being loaded into the aircraft, but there's no date given for this photo. This particular aircraft was first delivered to Eastern Airlines in 1936, and TWA acquired it 4 years later. And when World War II began, it then went into service as an Air Force plane and was returned to the airline at the end of the war. On the left here is a Piedmont Airlines DC3, and on the right is an American Airlines aircraft, both from the Marshall collection. And Piedmont operated from 1948 through 1989. When it was acquired by and merged into US Air. And this newspaper article here is from the February 20th, 1948 edition of the Kentucky Post. And this describes the first Piedmont flight at the Greater Cincinnati Airport. And that flight departed from Wilmington, North Carolina, and it was met here by members of the airport board as well as city officials for Northern Kentucky and Cincinnati. And a celebratory luncheon was also served afterwards. And here is a Delta Airlines stewardess, and she was motioning toward a DC-7, which is noted as the last one to leave the airport. And this is a photo of air traffic controllers, which was taken March 31st, 1970. And pictured here are Howard Smock, Paul Gibbons, and Robert Hess. And at the time this photo was published, there was a strike going on of air traffic controllers, which was part of a move by PATCO, or the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, to try to gain control of all 6 of the labor groups that represented them. And this is from September 18th, 1970. And this is a passenger who was walking through a metal detector before boarding his flight to New York City. And several days before this flight, there were 3 calls made by someone. One call was made to the Inquirer, another to a television station, and the third one was made to the FBI office in Cincinnati. And each one of these calls had a nervous sounding person on the phone who had the same message saying that the TWA flight to New York was going to be hijacked. And prior to this, there had been a string of hijackings and attempted hijackings, and one of which occurred in November of 1969 when 14-year-old David Booth attempted to hijack a Delta Airlines flight that was going from Cincinnati to Chicago. So when these calls came in before this flight, Cincinnati police were at the airport on standby. And then with no TSA formed yet in 1970, TWA had their own security team. So personnel from the airline searched passengers' luggage, and they brought in Bill West of Kansas City, who headed the airline security department. And as a result of this, these suspicious phone calls, he had metal detectors set up at the gate along with portable scanning devices. And many passengers who were boarding this flight were very startled by the heightened security. And in an Inquirer article that was written about it, it noted that many of them exchanged worried glances, others grinned nervously, and some shrugged as they filed in line to go through the metal detector. Fortunately, nothing suspicious was found, and the flight departed at its scheduled time for New York. This photo is from our Kentucky Post collection in Faces and Places. And this is TWA Captain James Lincoln, who is pointing to the glide slope dial and explaining how the instrument works in this photo from November 23rd, 1970. And this was taken a week after the November 14th plane crash, where a chartered Southern Airways DC-9 carrying the Marshall University football team crashed into a hillside just short of the runway as it was trying to land at the Huntington, West Virginia airport on a rainy night. And 75 people were killed in that crash, including 3 Cincinnatians who were on the flight. And they were Bob Harris, Mark Andrews, and Jack Repasy. And Jack and Mark had been roommates at Marshall and former classmates at Moeller High School in Cincinnati. And the airport in Huntington had an inadequate instrument landing system, and it did not have a glide slope beam that would tell the pilots whether the approach to the runway was too low or too high. So in this photo, Captain Lincoln was describing how this instrument operates during landing. And here, a group of children were on the flight deck of a Boeing 727 in July of 1971 when a group of 76 orphan children were taken on a scenic flight, and the TWA crew donated its time for this flight, which took the kids over parts of Kentucky, Steubenville, Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, and also Parkersburg, West Virginia, which was the hometown of Captain George Miller. And some of the children who were interviewed for the story on this flight were a bit frightened at first by the fast takeoff. And as they left the plane, each of the kids took with them a package of airplane photos, which was given to them by Captain Miller. And here is an undated photo that we have showing kids on board an American Airlines jet. From the left is Mrs. Harry A. Lockwood, Donna Qualls, Timmy Brown, Captain Rod Kesting, and Jimmy Royce. And in this picture, we see travelers and employees at the TWA ticket counter. They're probably feeling a little bit weary after all 421 of TWA's domestic flights were canceled on November 5th, 1973. And this affected about 35,000 passengers across the country. But here at the airport, this affected 22 of their departures that day in Cincinnati. And as part of this strike, flight attendants were seeking wages and benefits that were more equal to competing airlines. And so they set up picket lines at New York metro airports, which included Kennedy, LaGuardia, and Newark. And this strike lasted for a little bit over a month. And as the airline, as they looked to bounce back from this, they announced that they would begin service with the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar aircraft, which would fly from Cincinnati to St. Louis and then on to Los Angeles. And the L-1011 was the quietest airliner at the time and was able to be flown fully automatically from takeoff to landing. And some of the features that they described in the announcement on the aircraft were swivel rocker seats in first class, smoking and non-smoking sections, stereo entertainment, and TWA's ambassador meal service, which offered passengers a choice of 5 entrees in first class and 3 in coach. And this is a photograph from the newspaper announcement on December 23rd, 1973. And that was from the Cincinnati Enquirer. And this is passenger Ann Dooley, who was passing the time before her flight by reading a magazine near the Union Terminal murals at the airport. And this was from 1974. And here is Kevin Delaney, who was an air traffic controller from Fort Mitchell, and he's pictured in the tower in September of 1980. And these are a couple of photos in the terminals. On the left is Ron Cook of Erlanger, who was installing a very high light fixture that was heading up to the terminal. And on the right is Stella Blackburn, who was working at the Queen City Country Store, and that was in the American Airlines terminal. And in this photo, she was reaching over for penny candy. And This is a photo also from our Kentucky Post collection. And on this one, the photographer noted that chairs got little use each time a plane pulled up to the gate, and passengers would flock to the windows for a better view. This is a view of the US Air and Piedmont ticket counters in the summer of 1981. And in the terminal here is Kevin Carr, who was watching his dad's plane leave. And on the right are passengers playing a game of knock on the floor of Terminal A. William Heilman is pictured here, and he was a pilot for Aramec Airlines and was checking his instruments in this photo. This was from 1981. Aramec was a small commuter airline that was founded in Clarksburg, West Virginia, and was founded in 1951, and it operated until 1983 when it was merged into another airline called Wright Airlines, and that one filed for bankruptcy the following year in September of 1984. And the airport experienced a very tragic event on June 2nd, 1983, when Air Canada Flight 797, which had originated in Dallas and was headed to Montreal, caught fire mid-flight. And this fire, it started in an area of the plane behind the lavatory, and it quickly spread, which filled the plane with smoke. And they made an emergency landing at the airport, and as emergency exit doors were opened, and with the mix of oxygen and the heat of the fire, this created a much more intense blaze. So with the fire and the very thick smoke, many passengers were not able to find their way to an exit. And of the 46 passengers and crew members, there were 23 people who died, and many were injured. And this is Donald Ingen of the NTSB, and he is carrying the flight recorder to a vehicle while other NTSB inspectors walk around the damaged DC-9. These are a couple of photos afterwards. On the left is Ted Morris of Air Canada, who was speaking during a press conference, and on the right is Dave Pember, also speaking during a press conference. And after the investigation, they were unable to determine why and how the fire started. And as a result of the Air Canada accident, there were many changes that were made to aviation safety, and this included the FAA requirement that lavatories contain smoke detectors, as well as emergency truck lighting near the floor, among others. This is Richard Forrest, who was a passenger on the flight, and he was injured and was treated at Booth Memorial Hospital, and he was the last person to get off the plane. On the photo there on the right, he's walking out of the hospital about a week after the crash with his wife, Betty. And this is a photograph of an airplane with a broken emergency chute after a flight made an emergency landing at the airport on May 17th, 1984. And this flight was heading from Nashville to Detroit, and there was an emergency light that came on, which pointed to an engine malfunction. So the plane landed at the airport, and it was evacuated after control tower personnel informed the pilot that there was smoke coming from the engine on the tail. And when the emergency door was opened and passengers tried to exit the plane, the chute deflated, and this injured several people. And here, passengers are getting tickets at the People Express ticket counter, and on the picture at the right, they are deplaning from a People Express jet. And both of these photos are from 1985. During this time, this airline was expanding and they had acquired Frontier Airlines for about $300 million. But just a couple of years later, in 1987, they merged with Continental Airlines. And here, moving walkways are being constructed. And this is before the opening of the new Delta concourse, which was opened in 1987 after 13 months of construction, and it cost $45 million. In 1988, Cincinnati's Syncom Systems chartered a British Airways Concord, and the plane brought employees and customers from London to Cincinnati for a Syncom conference. And the Concorde was a supersonic airliner, and it had an ability to travel at twice the speed of sound. So flights to and from Europe had an average flight time of only 3.5 hours. So before landing in Cincinnati, the aircraft did a low-level fly around. And this is the crew of the Concorde: Bill Hornby, a flight engineer, Ian Watson, a first officer, and Bill Brown, a flight engineer. They were all from London, England. And the Concorde landed in Cincinnati at 10:55 a.m. on June 10th, 1988. And this was Delta Airlines President and CEO Ronald Allen and Governor Wallace Wilkinson as they were announcing a $315 million expansion at the airport, and this was in October of 1990. And this project would double Delta's gates at the airport from 25 to 50. And this also included the construction of a new passenger terminal, a new building for mail sorting, a new de-icing facility, and a 20,000 square foot expansion of the cargo handling building. And here is Delta Airlines Chief Pilot Gene Hawthorne, and he was giving a briefing for a test flight over Delhi, Ohio. And this 4-hour test flight was conducted while residents slept, and was conducted to test landing patterns. And the tests were done by airport officials, the FAA, the Kenton County Airport Board, and Aviation Planning Associates. And the test was done so they could measure whether a new landing approach to the airport was quieter than the one it replaced, as the neighborhoods in the area of Cheviot, Delhi, and Green Township, they had experienced a lot of aircraft noise following the opening of the north-south runway in January of 1991. And this is Mary Staples of Dallas, Texas, who she was the symbolic 1 billionth Delta passenger on July 27th, 1992. And airline officials were not able to pinpoint the exact 1 billionth passenger, but they knew that it would occur sometime that day. So they decided to choose to honor a passenger on flight 511 from Dallas to Cincinnati, because these were two of Delta's major hubs. So when she got off the flight, she was surrounded by Delta personnel, and at first she thought that she had done something wrong before they'd made the announcement that she was the 1 billionth passenger. And for this, she was gifted with a vacation to Disney World. And Mary Staples was a lobbyist in town and was here for a convention of state legislators. And so Amid all of the excitement, she ended up missing her shuttle bus to her Cincinnati hotel, so Delta ended up giving her a ride into the city. This is a photo of pilots and passengers in Terminal D and a lineup of Delta aircraft at the gates. And this is the newly opened Delta concourse as it was in 1993. And the many new gates helped relieve Delta's their need for space because passengers on some flights previously had to be taken by bus to the jets that were parked near the hangar. And this is a Continental Airlines jet landing at the Greater Cincinnati Airport. And here a Delta jet and a Comair prop plane in the back are waiting their turn to take off. And a Boeing 727 owned by Continental Airlines is pictured here. And this plane was taking off, heading to Denver. And a couple of last photos show a Comair employee photographing damage to one of their planes. And the photo on the left is a Comair Embraer Brasilia aircraft. And thank you for watching. For more historic photos of Northern Kentucky, please visit our Faces and Places database at facesandplaces.kentonlibrary.org. And if you have any questions, please contact us at the local history and genealogy department at 859-962-4070 or send us an email at history@kentonlibrary.org. Thanks.